Today we are reviving a series I call Tales from LeftTube, where I respond to videos made by leftist YouTubers which I don't like very much. Today we are looking at Hakim's video about socialism and commodity production.
A frequent discussion point some people have trouble grappling with is commodity production, specifically commodity production within former socialist experiments. Some people use this as a learned catchphrase in order to dismiss former socialisms entirely, while others simply have no understanding of the what and why of commodity production within, say, for example, the Soviet Union. Hopefully, this video will clear this point up. So, what is commodity production? In essence, any product of labor made for exchange is a commodity. As Lenin put it, a commodity is, in the first place, a thing that satisfies a human want. In the second place, it is a thing that can be exchanged for another thing. This is in line with Marx's chapter on commodities in Capital Volume 1. In that case, then, what is commodity production? Commodity production is production for exchange on the market. As you can imagine, commodity production came into existence with the emergence of a certain set of material conditions, and with changing material conditions, commodity production changed too.
And it's right out of the gate with the Marxist-Leninist mechanical materialism. Raya Dunevskaya points out in her book Marxism and Freedom that Marx did not see commodity production as merely a set of material conditions, quote-unquote. She emphasizes how Marx sees commodity production as the product of a particular type of human labor, this being abstract labor. The point here is that Marx did not talk of generalized material conditions, but of the social relations between people that create specific types of human labor.
Initially, within primitive society, there was little to no commodity production. With innovation and the development of the productive forces of primitive man, the conditions for simple commodity production took form. The product of individual labor, with simple trade of occasional small surplus of, for example, farm produce, is the starting point of said simple commodity production. As this was a result of mostly individual labor, the amount of labor time and other conditions varied between producers, but the market price remained the same. Whether it took you, a wheat farmer in Mesopotamia, 2 weeks or 1 week to cut and bring to market a single bushel of wheat does not matter, as both bushels, assuming they are of similar quality, would have been set for the same price on the market.
Is Hakim arguing that socially necessary labor time doesn't exist in simple commodity production? Why? Marx introduces socially necessary labor time before he even introduces money. If socially necessary labor time applies for Marx in a hypothetical scenario where two commodities are exchanged for each other rather than for money, then I don't see how it doesn't apply in simple commodity production. Moreover, what does Hakim even mean by simple commodity production? He seems to mean that simple commodity production is where commodities are produced only by individual labor, but for Marx all commodities are the result of social labor. So what is even the basis for this concept of simple commodity production?
Continuing this thread into feudalism, the differing conditions and labor time going into the production of commodities would result in, over a long period of time, polarization, where, on one hand, a smaller number of people accumulate commodities, money, etc., which can be turned into capital, and on the other hand, a large group of people would end up being outcompeted on the market, forcing them into bankruptcy and the sale of their labor power as a last resort. This rudimentary overview leads into capitalist commodity production. Within capitalist commodity production, those that have accumulated capital, meaning capitalists, maintain private ownership of the means of production.
Private ownership doesn't matter. Commodity production under capitalism doesn't require that private entities own production. It simply requires that all spheres of production are commodified so that exchange is no longer a peripheral or marginal feature of the social system.
With capitalists firmly holding employment within their hands, workers have to sell their labor power to capitalists in return for a wage. From the sale of labor power by the worker to the capitalist, work is done and there occurs capitalist exploitation resulting in the extraction of surplus value. Essentially, labor power itself becomes a commodity. This is, in simple terms, wage labor. This did not exist under feudalism or slave society, and with controversy existed in some form in pre-capitalist formations in the Greater West Asia and North Africa region, as well as East Asia, which is a topic for another video. Since we have established that commodity production existed in various forms during different socioeconomic conditions, essentially meaning under different material conditions, would commodity production continue, albeit under a different form, under socialism? This is where lived experience of socialism enters, challenging certain theoretical conceptions prior to socialist experiments existing, and adding a healthy coat of controversy, and boy do we love controversy. Historically, within socialist societies,
here Hakim is begging the question, a fallacy where you assume your conclusion at the outset without justifying said conclusion. Hakim simply assumes that there have been socialist societies. I don't see any reason to call the Communist Party-dominated republics that first appeared in the 20th century socialist.
Commodity production of a different kind did exist, primarily due to certain limiting factors. Foremost amongst these reasons is simply circumstance, and the development and success of certain revolutionary movements over others. Modifying Lenin, revolution occurs at the weakest links of capitalism, contrary to Marx's assumptions. History has proven Lenin right, and as a result, revolution swept through not highly industrialized imperial core countries, but agrarian and semi-feudal nations first. Russia, China, Vietnam, Cuba, etc. This resulted in differing contradictions than those assumed within highly industrialized imperial core countries. Russia, for example, had a majority peasant population, and the industrial proletariat was but a slim minority. Immediately, the political course of the USSR was clear, as illustrated by Lenin's work The Tax in Kind. Establish the peasantry, particularly poor and middle peasants, as an ally class to the proletariat, and maintain harmony between the workers and peasants until sufficient proletarianization can occur within the peasantry.
The fact that the Bolsheviks were interested in proletarianization should tell you something about the kind of society they were building. Proletarianization is a capitalist process. Capitalism is the social system which makes more and more people dependent on wage labor income. The idea of proletarianization in a socialist society is quite frankly ridiculous. And the Bolsheviks realized this, which is why they didn't call Russia under their control socialist until 1936.
Through the development of productive forces so that they transition from a private plot peasant production to collective farm production, and then finally to an industrial proletariat within agriculture. This entails a transition from collective farms, a kolkhoz in Russian, to state farms, a sovkhoz, something the USSR was actively doing.
No, the collective farm sector and the state sector were just two different sectors.
Side note, why can't you just proletarianize the peasantry into workers with industrial agricultural farms? Well, this leads into the issues of pragmatism. Peasants in agrarian or semi-feudal societies are intensely attached to their small plots of land, so expropriating and absorbing them into larger industrial farms would effectively kill your connection with the peasantry. Add on top of that the usual instability present during early revolutionary periods, and you'd end up with a course of action not only inadvisable, but also near impossible. How does socialism leap over this hurdle? Thanks to learning the errors and successes of former socialist experiments, we now realize that the slow transition from private plots to collective farms and finally industrial state farms is the correct course if we want to maintain harmony with the peasant class as well as maintain general stability in the countryside.
That never happened. Collective and state farms in the Soviet Union were simply the mechanism Stalin used to expropriate the peasants. The Bolsheviks, in fact, were already expropriating the peasants during the Civil War, but had to go back on this policy and liberalize agricultural production with the NEP, so they didn't fall out of favor with the peasantry. Once Stalin had political control, he carried out an extremely rapid process of peasant expropriation that is historically known for its radical, breakneck, and heavy-handed nature. Peasant property was seized without distinction, and those who resisted were punished with exile, prison labor, and death. There was no slow transition. Supposedly this is what Bukharin wanted, but any credible historical study shows that this isn't what happened.
Back on track though. This talk of collective and state ownership generally underpins the differing forms of ownership under socialism. What are those forms, you ask? Well, simple. You have, firstly, ownership by the whole people and collective ownership. As these two forms of ownership exist, it is not feasible to have unpaid allocation of products between the two, a necessary component of abolishing commodity production. For example, within the USSR, the collective farms would produce agricultural goods with the intention of sale on a limited market between the collective farms and the state. Further derived from this, most trade between the state and the collective farms took the form of commodities. This is commodity exchange, meaning commodity production. Side point. Some people also argue that since certain goods, for example consumer goods distributed by the state in shops, are exchanged through money, this too is a component of commodity production. I tend to disagree with this point, as money functions, and historically functioned, differently under socialism, but this is a discussion for another time. Anyhow, just because the two forms, collective ownership and ownership by the whole people, existed, does not make it capitalist commodity production. Socialist commodity production differed, primarily in that the economic exploitation of workers through the extraction of surplus value did not exist, and nor did market functions determine production, with commodity exchange being a limited and reluctantly accepted necessity of the circumstances. Furthermore, there was no market for labor power to be exchanged as a commodity, as employment was guaranteed by the state, and, during the best times, managers did not have the right to hire and fire, and at the worst, had incredibly limited power in this regard.
Hakim makes a two-pronged argument that commodity production in existing socialism was not capitalist. One, there was not extraction of surplus value and markets weren't the determining force of production. And two, there was no buying of labor power because there was full employment. Point one is basically irrelevant because Hakim doesn't cite anything in support of his assertion. He simply unequivocally states that there was no surplus value extraction and markets didn't determine production. Point two is actually given supporting evidence that there was full employment. However, I have no idea why full employment precludes the buying and selling of labor power. I don't see why everyone can't be employed, but nevertheless, the condition of everyone's employment is that employers buy their labor power. One could argue that the two can't exist at the same time because the buying and selling of labor power requires a reserve army of labor in the form of the unemployed. This allows capital to expand and contract according to accumulation cycles. However, existing socialism did have underemployment, i.e. underutilization of workers. I don't see how this wouldn't perform the function of a reserve army of labor.
Nevertheless, even socialist commodity production reproduced bourgeois right, and as a result gave impetus to the socialist necessity that is abolishing commodity production. So, does that mean that we want to rid ourselves of commodity production? Of course, you will not find a single Marxist that wants the perpetual continuation of commodity production. However, an understanding of the facts and material conditions is necessary. Commodity production is not a button we press to turn on or off. Its elimination, like the construction of socialism, is a process that is gradual and will take place through numerous steps and many years. This entails eliminating the material conditions that give rise to commodity production, which entails, for example, within socialist nations of agrarian or semi-feudal origin, the gradual transition away from collective farm production, amongst other things. Political considerations, the relationship between the peasantry and the proletariat, national stability, and many other things need to be taken into account. With that also in mind, we have to also realize that the existence of numerous modes of production can be present at one time or different times within a single nation, as Lenin illustrated in the aforementioned essay. Essentially making reductionist claims of not socialism because commodity production, no. As you may imagine, things are always more complicated.
I don't care about socialism that preserves commodity production. Commodity production requires an average amount of labor time it takes to produce any given commodity to be imposed on the producers. This means that it is not the producers that have control over production, but an abstract social force called the market. Socialism is either the society that puts producers in control of production so they can freely use it to develop themselves, or it is nothing at all. Existing socialism with its nomenclatura bureaucracy did not produce anything even on the way to producer control of production, and ultimately this video serves as an 11-minute post hoc justification for this failing.
Finally, a frequently neglected point in the commodity production discussion is this. Historically, global socialist revolution has not occurred. What has occurred is a single locus of revolution from which support and inspiration causes several revolutions to erupt nearby with limited levels of success. As a result, many socialist nations had to develop essentially on their own. As no nation on earth is fully self-sufficient in all its needs, this means that they needed to engage in some level of international trade. This engagement served two functions. Firstly, to buy foreign products of various kinds that are not available or cannot be produced within said socialist nation, and secondly, to sell products on the global market in order to acquire hard currency used for the first function mentioned. This would logically require said socialist nations to engage in some level of commodity production in order to produce goods that can be sold on the global market. This presents us with a political dilemma. Either we establish world revolution in order to circumvent the basic requirement of global trade for unpaid allocation of resources between nations, and hence aiding the full abolishment of commodity production, or we take Menshevik positions of believing that revolution, if not global, and especially in agrarian or semi-feudal nations, is inadvisable if not impossible. The first option is ideal, but unrealistic. The second is just plain silly. Marxists reject both options and choose the only path that has been historically possible. Conquer state power in as many places as possible, begin the construction of socialism, and support global movements, wherever they are, towards their aims of building a new and just society, not based on the exploitation of man, but on mutual cooperation and development.
So don't learn from historical failures and just do what the communists in the 20th century did over again because reasons. Amazing! Thanks for watching, everyone. Hope you enjoyed. I'm really just busy working on my book that I talked about in the Parenti video. I've changed the title numerous times. I think the title that I'm going to settle on is Existing Socialism. Um, and so since I've been working on that, I figured why not respond to a tank, because that would be in my wheelhouse right now. So, yeah. Again, hope you enjoyed. I hope to keep adding to the series on world systems analysis. Hopefully, the next video for that will be up soon. And yeah, see you later. If you wish to support me in any of these endeavors, my Patreon and my personal PayPal will be in the description. So, yeah. Thanks.